Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing Hamilton's Republic, the events surrounding the First Federal Congress, and to the end of the Adams administration. So let's get started. I would like to start off with a quote from Representative James Madison to the Attorney General Edmund Randolph, when he stated in a letter from May of 1789 that scarcely a day passes without some striking evidence of the delays and perplexities springing merely from the want of precedents. The Congress of the United States was established by the new Constitution and met for the first time in New York City's Federal Hall in March of 1789. It is arguably the most important Congress in United States history. To this new legislature fell the responsibility of passing all the legislation needed to implement the new system, solving the difficult political questions left over by the Constitutional Convention, and setting up the rules and procedures of the House and Senate, and establish the roles of officers such as Speaker of the House and President of the Senate. Most actions of the Federal Congress broke new ground. The first law passed set oaths of offices not only for Congress but for state legislatures, the federal executive officers, and state and federal judges. Other important legislation was to raise revenues by setting duties on imported goods, established the State Department, the War Department, and the Treasury. Although serving in the federal Congress was a distinct honor, it was also a hardship, as travel in the early 19th century or the late 18th century was slow. Congress met between 1785 and 1800. The trip could be arduous. Living in these cities while stimulating was expensive, and congressmen received a pay of only $6 per day. It also meant several months each year living away from their own livelihoods and usually their families. During the 1790s, one-third of the members of the Senate resigned while in office. The Constitution did not provide a design for the executive officers and the protocol. Therefore, it was up to George Washington to create the staff positions and establish presidential traditions. Washington authorized 4 executive departments: the Department of War, the Department of Treasury, the Department of State, and the Attorney General, and appointed respectively Henry Knox as the Secretary of War, Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson as head of the State Department, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. Washington's actions and demeanor would establish the precedents. As the first president, Washington was keenly aware that his presidency would set a precedent for all that would follow. He carefully attended to the responsibilities and duties of his office, remaining vigilant to not emulate the European royal courts, and to that end he preferred the title of Mr. President instead of more imposing names that had been suggested. At first, Washington declined the $25,000 salary that Congress had offered, for he was already wealthy and wanted to protect his image as a selfless public servant. However, Congress persuaded him to accept the compensation to avoid giving the impression that only wealthy men could serve as president. Washington proved to be a capable administrator, and he surrounded himself with some of the most capable people in the country. So Washington's cabinet became a consulting body. There hadn't been many rules written in the Constitution regarding the president's cabinet. In fact, Washington's cabinet members formed rival parties with sharply opposing viewpoints, most fiercely illustrated by the difference of ideas and opinions of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. He did restrict the cabinet discussions to topics of his choosing, and he did not participate in the debates. Occasionally, he requested that cabinet opinions should be submitted in writing, and that the executive department chairs agree to carry out his decisions. A major problem facing the first federal government was how to deal with the financial chaos created by the American Revolution. States themselves had huge war debts, there was runaway inflation, and almost all areas of the economy looked dismal throughout the 1780s. Economic hard times were a major factor in creating the sense of crisis that produced the stronger central government under the new Constitution. George Washington chose Alexander Hamilton, who had served with him throughout the Revolutionary War, to take on the challenge of directing the federal economy. Hamilton himself was a fascinating character. He was born in the West Indies to a single mother who was a shopkeeper, and after her death, he worked an apprentice for a large mercantile firm. Recognizing his genius, the members of the firm sent Alexander Hamilton to New York to attend King's College or Columbia University. Hamilton also had other influential connections besides George Washington. He was friends with leading New York merchants and financiers, and in 1780 he was married to Elizabeth Schuyler from a wealthy family in New York, whose father had served as a general in the Revolutionary War. So it's up to Hamilton and his innovative Federalist policies. He helped overcome many of the fiscal problems facing the new nation, and he also benefited the economic elite, which he had close ties. So up until this point, there had been a very sharp division with Federalist policy, especially in the matters of finance, and this is represented by the contrasting views of Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton's proposals would enhance the authority of the national government as he favored merchants and financiers. His three proposals include the report on public credit to deal with the national debt and currency, the creation of the national bank, and a report on manufacturing. Hamilton was very cynical about human nature, and during the Constitutional Convention, he had stated, "All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God, and however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give therefore to the first class a distinct permanent share in government, and they will check the unsteadiness of the second." Hamilton had once stated that direct democracy was a disease or a poison. The most immediate need of the new government was credit. Americans' experience under the Articles of Confederation demonstrated that no government could endure without the ability to borrow. In its later days, the Continental Congress had presented the spectacle of a government at the end of its financial tethers. As a result of the War of Independence, the states as well as the central government had accumulated large debts. Unfortunate for the American taxpayer, but before the state and the federal governments could regain their ability to borrow, adequate provisions had to be made to deal with the existing debt. In 1789, the national debt totaled over $50 million, $11 million which was owed to the governments of France and Spain and private bankers of the Netherlands, while $40 million was in the interest of securities held by the citizens of the United States. In 1789, the national debt totaled over $50 million, $11 million which was owed to France and Spain and private bankers in the Netherlands, and the bulk of the money, $40 million, was in the form of securities held by the citizens of the United States. As Secretary of Treasury, Hamilton proceeded to draw upon a report on public credit, which reflected his political as well as his financial convictions. See, privately, he had distinguished sharply between the generality of considerate men and the community at large. In his eyes, the mass of the people were so devoted to their states that they had very little affection or loyalty toward the national government. So Hamilton was designing his hopes on trying to entice the businessmen, the educated, and the professional men who thought continentally. The first part of the report on public credit suggested that Congress should redeem the millions of dollars of debt issued by the Articles of Confederation. This action would provide considerable profits to speculators who had scoured the country acquiring the devalued paper currency. Remember, most of this currency had been held by veterans of the American Revolution. James Madison had made a proposal that would have assisted the original owners of the currency, but this was rejected. The second part of the report proposed that the United States would assume the war debts of the state governments. Sometimes referred to as the Assumption Plan, Hamilton visualized it as a double-edged sword, and this way he could strike at the roots of state sovereignty. In the first place, it promised to bring within the orbit of the federal government all the state creditors, the most influential parts of the community. And secondly, it would have relieved the states of the necessity of levying taxes. For if the federal government took it upon itself, the payment of all debts, it must have all the revenue. And by possessing the whole of the revenue, it came into possession of the whole power of the Union. James Madison opposed the report on public credit, and he referred to it as a perfidious desertion of the principles which he, Madison, was solemnly pledged to defend. In his speech to Congress, Madison dwelt upon the plight of the soldiers, those hardy veterans who had compelled by economic necessity to sell their paper certificates for a pittance. There was, he exclaimed, and I quote, something radically immoral and consequently impolitic to permit the rewards to be transferred from the gallant earners of them to the class of people who now take their place. For Hamilton's perspective, he felt that the purchasers of these government securities were entitled to every penny of profit resulting from the funding of the national debt. They had supported the government's credit in its darkest hour, and they had risked their capital upon contingency amounting to little less than a revolutionary change in the government. The opponents of Hamilton's report charged that at least part of this speculative mania that was owing to the fact that certain privileged individuals had prior knowledge to the Secretary's plans. And although suspicion had touched even the Secretary himself, there was no evidence that Hamilton divulged the contents of his report to his friends. On the contrary, he resolved to place himself above the eagle-eyed suspicion. It was finally a compromise was reached over the debt funding plan and assumption. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had argued with Hamilton, and the two Virginians, in exchange for locating the capital in Philadelphia for 10 years, the capital would then be moved to the banks of the Potomac River in between Virginia and Maryland. Jefferson and Madison, in return, would pledge themselves to vote and get the Southern congressmen in favor of the report on public credit. We can see in this diagram an explanation of Hamilton's system of public credit and the debts owed both to foreign governments and to U.S. citizens and holders of those government securities. As you can see, between the revenue and funding the debt payments at full value, there was little money left. So the funding of the national debt and the assumption of the state debts had put the money into the hands of men, in Hamilton's opinion, who were best qualified to use it. The United States still lacked two essentials to properly function in the kind of capitalism that Hamilton envisioned. One was the adequate circulating amount of currency and a central structure, a bank, to institute it. For the Bank of the United States, Hamilton would borrow heavily from the Bank of England. Hamilton intended that the Bank of the United States should serve as the principal depository of government funds and the fiscal agents of the Treasury. In short, the government would support the bank, and the bank would support the government. And the rich men of the United States, already the owners of government securities, as stockholders in the bank, would be bound even more closely to the federal government. Hamilton's report encountered vigorous opposition from
agricultural interests in Congress, one of whom declared that he would no more be seen entering a bank than a house of ill repute. Both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had doubted that Congress even possessed the power to charter a bank. He found nothing in the Articles of Confederation nor the Constitution for the creation of one. Alexander Hamilton believed that the Constitution should be interpreted broadly, and that an institution, like a bank, was constitutional because it was not strictly forbidden. This is a concept known as the implied powers. So the way Hamilton defined it was under the necessary and proper clause, which states that if an institution is necessary and proper, which meant that it wasn't strictly forbidden by the Constitution, then a bank could be constitutional. The debate over the bank was finally compromised by limiting the bank's charter for 20 years. That means from its creation, and for the next 20 years, the next generation would have to vote to recharter the bank if they decided to keep it. In December of 1791, Hamilton submitted the Report on Manufacturing, which was intended to provide the cornerstone to his plans for revolutionizing the American government and economy. Hamilton had conducted an exhaustive study of world economic conditions and governmental policies. In this investigation, he revealed that thanks to private enterprise, together with protective duties imposed by state governments, that some branches of manufacturing, notably nails, ships, shoes, iron, and steel, had really prospered in the United States. In the Report on Manufacturing, Hamilton set out the reasons why it was important for Americans to follow the examples of Western European countries and foster industrialization. Hamilton really saw the Report on Manufacturers as a supplement to the Constitution. It was a supposed blueprint for a more perfect economic union. If his plans were realized, northern ships would carry raw southern materials into northern factories, and commerce and wealth would flow in a north to south direction instead of pursuing the well-worn transatlantic route. The two mechanisms through which the Report on Manufacturing would manifest would be an increase in the tariff and an excise tax on whiskey. Hamilton's financial plans did see results. Over 40 new corporations began. The states began to charter new banks, and it brought a number of European investors into the United States. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had led the opposition against Hamilton's financial policies. They had made compromises over the Assumption Plan by compromising the location of the United States Capitol. The bank's charter was limited, but they would continue their opposition, and Thomas Jefferson would remain an opponent to Hamilton's policies. In 1796, Thomas Jefferson was barely defeated by John Adams, who would become the second president of the United States. We also need to turn our attention to the foreign policy of the United States under the Washington and Adams administrations. One of the main focuses was to secure the frontiers. As you can see, the Northwest Territories are highlighted in the map to the right. This acquisition of land in the Northwest under the Treaty of Paris in 1783 had been largely rejected by Native Americans, who preferred the treaty with the British, which guaranteed native control over Ohio. But following the Treaty of Paris, the British had abandoned their native allies. Many of the Iroquois had fled to Canada, but then some of them were returning in the 1780s and moving back into the Ohio River Valley. It is also a point to note that the British were supplying the Iroquois with weapons, and that the British had not yet evacuated most of their troops from the Mississippi River trading post. After losses in 1790 and 91, Washington appointed General Anthony Wayne to the task of securing the territories. As American settlers moved into the Northwest Territories in the following years after the American Revolution, their advance was opposed by a loosely organized, mainly Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Shawnee and the Delaware, both of whom had been driven out uh, by prior territorial encroachments. Led by a Native American called Little Turtle, this loose confederation skirmished with settlers in Ohio and the Kentucky militia in the 1780s. In an effort to pacify the region and to stake a conclusive claim to the areas that had been seceded by the British under the Treaty of Paris, a series of expeditions was dispatched. In August of 1794, General Anthony Wayne's 2,000 regulars and supplemented by some thousand mounted Kentucky militiamen, fought in what was called the Battle of Fallen Timbers, in which Wayne's troops broke the Indian lines and forced their retreat. This defeat was compounded by the evaporation of support from the British, who had become entangled in the French Revolution and did not want to risk any further confrontation with the United States. Within months of the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Britain made clear its intentions with Jay's Treaty, and which we'll subsequently talk about. Beaten in battle and with no prospect for assistance from the outside world, the Confederation of Native Americans decided to set terms with the Americans. In August of 1795, Little Turtle and his delegations met with the United States and concluded the Treaty of Grenville. Both sides agreed to terminate hostilities and exchange prisoners, and Little Turtle and the Native Americans authorized a redefinition of the border between the United States and Indian lands. By terms of the treaty, the Confederation ceded all lands east and south of the boundary that became the mouth of the Chickamauga River in modern-day Cleveland. This extended south to the Fort Laurens in modern Bolivar, Ohio, and then west to Fort Recovery. On the southeastern frontier, there was a similar situation to that of the Northwest Territories. There were troubles with the Creek, Cherokee, and Chickasaw tribes. These natives had sided with the British during the American Revolution. And there were also numerous attempts by the Spanish to undermine American authority in this region. There was another problem emerging on the frontier in western Pennsylvania, and it was a reaction to Hamilton's excise tax on grain and whiskey. A short-lived rebellion, known as the Whiskey Rebellion, took place. It was subdued when Washington led himself 15,000 troops to suppress this rebellion. At first, Washington sought to resolve the dispute peacefully, and in 1792 he issued a proclamation which stated the operations of the laws of the United States for raising revenue upon spirits distilled within the same. However, by 1794, the protesters were becoming violent, and in July, nearly 400 whiskey rebels near Pittsburgh set fire to the home of a regional tax collector. Left with little recourse, Washington used the militia and warned that not to abet, aid, or comfort the insurgents aforesaid, and that they will answer the contrary at their peril. By the time Washington and the militia reached Pittsburgh, most of the rebel groups had broken up. The militia apprehended approximately 150 men, and they were tried for treason. However, there was a lack of evidence and an inability to obtain witnesses. Two men, John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, were found guilty of treason, though both were pardoned by President Washington. By 1802, President Thomas Jefferson repealed the excise tax on whiskey. In 1789, at the same time that the first U.S. Congress was held, a violent revolution broke out in France. The French Revolution had a tremendous impact on American politics and divided Washington's cabinet. The real split was between Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, and the head of the Democratic Republican Party, who had sympathized with the French people. Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury and leader of the Federalists, thought that our relationship with Britain was more important. Within 4 years of the beginning of the French Revolution, It took a radical turn when the left wing of the French Parliament, called the Jacobins, took over control of the country and executed King Louis XVI. And as Britain and France warred, the United States had been caught in the middle. The radical Jacobin faction unleashed the Reign of Terror on France, and there was concern amongst American politicians that these kind of changes would sweep into the United States, along with guillotines. In April of 1793, the French minister Citizen Genet came to the United States and began to recruit privateers to attack British shipping in the Atlantic. He had not consulted with President Washington, and Washington called for a meeting with Genet, and by this time the Jacobin government had fell from power in the United States. Washington issued the Neutrality Act, which prevented Americans from engaging in conflicts and privateering with countries that the United States was not officially at war. The major issue was that of American neutrality on the high seas. Stuck in the middle of the conflict between Britain and France, both countries raided our shipping, and the British began a policy known as the Orders in Council, in which they would board American vessels and seize our citizens and take them captive on the high seas to fight against the French. The formation of political parties in the United States was not entirely accounted for. Early on, politics had been divided into factions rather than official political parties. The difference really being that factions are temporary and parties are built around long-term goals. Factions tend to be more local or are organized around a specific interest. Whereas factions are personal, parties survive the defeats of individuals. Some thought that the idea of political parties was offensive to Republican ideology and appealed where people would appeal to parties' interest and self-interest. Republics are fragile because they lack hierarchy, which makes them vulnerable to party corruption. The Constitution does not specifically define the role that political parties would play in the United States government. Though there was little skepticism, most people anticipated no political parties because most states had signed on the U.S. Constitution. But really, after the first two presidential administrations, Washington and Adams, and the implementation of Hamilton's financial plans, we see those plans going into effect and affecting different sections of the country with radically different economics. The Democratic Republican Party, or Jeffersonians, were formed out of Jefferson's disagreement with Hamilton's policies. James Madison had organized the party in Congress, and publicly it was organized by John Beckley. Opposition to Hamilton was finally mobilizing, and it started from local campaigns and popular organizations. But by 1793, there were 11 Democratic-Republican political societies. The main theorist of the Democratic-Republican Party was John Taylor of Caroline. He had been a planter, and he had blamed Hamilton for creating political parties. He wrote a treatise called The Definition of Parties, or the Political Effect of the Paper System, considered in 1794. The Democratic Republicans supported more power for the state governments and a restriction on the central government. Hamilton also began to organize his supporters under the name of the Federalist, and he was able to recruit members to Congress such as Rufus King. Hamilton also established a number of pro-Federalist newspapers. Where Democratic Republican support came from agricultural regions, most of the Federalist support came from the larger cities and ports. The Federalists favored a strong central government and a loose interpretation of the Constitution. John Adams, the second president of the United States, was a direct descendant of Puritan colonists from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He had studied at Harvard, and he was admitted to the bar, In 1774, he served on the First Continental Congress and was one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence. As Adams was the second-place winner in the 1792 elections, he served as Washington's vice president. But this position caused him great frustration because he did not have much sway over political or legal issues. In 1796, Adams was elected on the Federalist ticket, defeating Thomas Jefferson by a very narrow margin. In the mid-1790s, a slave revolt broke out on the island of St. Domingo. 2 months after Adams took office as president, he did recognize the independence of the Dominican Republic. Although the revolt started under George Washington, the Washington administration made no efforts to support the Dominican or the Haitian Revolution. Adams, who opposed slavery, saw St. Domingo as a useful ally, and he views it as another country trying to navigate the world dominated by European powers. So Adams had established diplomatic trade and relations with St. Domingo, and from 1798 to 1801, the U.S. government treated the leaders of African descent with the same respect afforded to the Europeans. This would not happen again until the Civil War. Because of the Napoleonic Wars, or the Wars of the French Revolution, French ships that were at war with England were beginning to seize American ships crossing the Atlantic. In response, Adams had sent a delegation to France to negotiate, but once they arrived, they were asked to pay a bribe to the French minister Talleyrand. Adams used this and released the information of the news. It became known as the XYZ affair, and he asked Congress to mobilize the military forces. What this began was known as the Quasi-War. Simply put, the Quasi-War of 1798 to 1799 was an undeclared war on French shipping as a result of the XYZ affair. Over the course of about 9 months, the United States managed to capture around 60 French vessels. Because of the radicalism of the French Revolution and the fear that those radical ideas may spread to the United States, the Adams administration passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the acts were really designed to protect the United States from this perceived threat of revolutionary France. But what it really did was it created martyrs out of the Democratic Republicans who had supported the French Revolution. It's really, the Alien and Sedition Acts were an effort to suppress French sedition, and Congress had passed 3 acts. The first was the Naturalization Act of 1798, and this changed the amount of time immigrants had to wait before they could become new citizens. Most new immigrants had supported Thomas Jefferson. Now, under the Naturalization Act of 1795, immigrants had to reside in the United States for 5 years. This new act, in 1798, changed the residency period to 14 years. The second act was concerning aliens, and the act concerning enemy aliens. These acts gave the president the right to imprison and deport aliens that were considered dangerous. Another part of this law allowed the president to imprison males over 14 from any nation that the United States was at war with. Lastly was the Sedition Act. This act was the most controversial. It restricted speech that was critical of the federal government, and many Jeffersonian-supported newspapers were prosecuted under the Sedition Act. When these acts centered on the Democratic Republicans, and they, to the public, were seen as political tools, this would aid in Jefferson's victory in the election of 1800. But that's for another lecture. Once again, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you soon.